Good evening, everyone. Nice to see everyone here. My name is, how's the sound? Good. Okay, great. My name's Alana Cooper. I direct the Jewish Lifelong Learning Program at Case Western Reserve University. We're thrilled to be here at the Temple Tiferet Israel. And I also want to thank our co-sponsors, which includes the Temple Tiferet Israel, with support from the Deborah Hartzmark Jacobs Book Talk Fund and the Isidore and Toby Helfand Torah Study Fund. We're thrilled to be able to have these kind of partnerships to bring these sorts of programs to the community. I am going to shortly announce, introduce our speaker and also tell you a little bit about the series that this really kicks off. But before I do so, I just want to do a plug for a big event that we have coming up unrelated to this series. On July 9th, we're going to have Robert Watson will be in town from Florida, and he'll be speaking at the Maltz Performing Arts Center on Hamilton, Man, Myth, Musical. We have postcards out in front. If you haven't yet registered for the lecture, please pick up a postcard or see one of the staff who's floating around in the back there. I also want to announce some of the upcoming programs that we have related to this particular series. But first, to give you some background. This series that Professor Menachem Rosensaft is going to be presenting in is really designed to mark 1 year since Elie Wiesel's passing. And in his memory and as a way to pass on his legacy, we've invited speakers in for the month of June to speak about different aspects, different perspectives on the mark that Elie Wiesel has left and the importance of continuing his legacy onward. And I'm thrilled to have Menachem Rosensaft with us here to kick off the series. Both for his related work that he's done and also for his intimate relationship with Elie Wiesel that I know he's going to be speaking about over the course of the next hour or so that we spend together. A few words about Menachem Rosensaft's background. He's a lawyer who received his JD from Columbia University, and in addition also holds an MA in creative writing and an MA in modern European history. Currently, Menachem Rosensaft serves as General Counsel of the World Jewish Congress, and he's also a lecturer at Columbia Law School. He's been a long-time leader in Holocaust remembrance activities and was appointed by President Barack Obama to the United States Holocaust Memorial Council. Previously, he was a member of the council for 2 terms from 1994 to 2004 and served on its executive committee. In 2009, he was a member of the US delegation to the International Conference on Holocaust-era Restitution Issues in Prague. Menachem Rosensaft has also been an activist on the international stage in many different ways. In 1985, he organized and led a demonstration at the mass graves of the Nazi concentration camp of Bergen-Belsen in protest against visits that day by President Ronald Reagan and West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl to Bergen-Belsen and the German military cemetery in Bitburg. In 1987, he played a key role in convincing the government of Panama not to give sanctuary to Nazi war criminal Karl Linnes and in ensuring Linnes's deportation from the US to the Soviet Union. In 1998, he was one of 5 American Jews who met in Stockholm with senior leaders of the Palestine Liberation Organization, resulting in the PLO's first public recognition of Israel. Menachem Rosensaft is also incredibly well published, both in the academic sphere and also in the more popular sphere. Very recently, he came out with a book that he edited, which is a history of the World Jewish Congress. And he also is the editor of God, Faith, and Identity from the Ashes, Reflections of Children and Grandchildren of Holocaust Survivors, which came out in 2014. That will be the topic of his talk tomorrow. If you have not signed up, Menachem will be speaking tomorrow afternoon at the Siegal Lifelong Learning Institute, our building, over lunch. If you're interested in signing up, please see one of the staff members afterwards. There's still a couple of seats left. And his book afterwards will be on sale in the back, and we will make him sit behind the table so that he can autograph them. Please give Menachem Rosensaft a very warm, super warm today, Cleveland welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Alana, for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here, and for this most gracious introduction. As I believe it was President Lyndon Johnson said in a somewhat different context, I'm truly sorry my parents weren't around to hear it. My father would have enjoyed it, and my mother would have believed it. It is rare for an individual to become a towering intellectual figure whose writings, thoughts, and actions not only influence, but fundamentally change the mindset of his or her generation and beyond. The philosophers Martin Buber and Jean-Paul Sartre come to mind, as do in different contexts human rights activists such as the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, Andrei Sakharov, and the Dalai Lama. Each one of them has come to represent a historical or moral watershed. For the last 3 decades of the 20th century and the first 16 years of the 21st, Elie Wiesel was one of those transformative personalities. More than anyone else, he seared a simultaneously uncompromising and comprehensible awareness of the Shoah and, above all, its moral implications into the consciousness of a global society that had done its utmost to avoid confronting it. When he wrote and spoke about the Holocaust, but also about so much more than the Holocaust, he did so in biblical psalmic terminology, as it were, min hametza, out of the depths. After his death on July 2nd of last year at the age of 87, President Barack Obama beautifully eulogized him as the conscience of the world. Much has been said and written, much remains to be said and written about this intellectual giant who, after emerging from the horrors of Auschwitz and Buchenwald, dedicated himself to perpetuating the memory of the millions of European Jews who were murdered in the Shoah. In doing so, he became the acknowledged voice of its survivors. He often said that he could not, would not, speak on behalf of the dead. He did, however, speak forcefully, eloquently, for the collectivity of the survivors, and they revered and loved him for it. Accept the idea that you will never see what they have seen and go on seeing now, he wrote in his classic essay, A Plea for the Survivors, perhaps subconsciously opening a window into his own heart. That you will never know the faces that haunt their nights, that you will never know the cries that rent their sleep. Accept the idea that you will never penetrate the cursed and spellbound universe they carry within themselves with unfailing loyalty. One of his priorities was to ensure and safeguard the authenticity of the memory of the Jewish men, women, and children who went through the horrors of what he famously referred to as the kingdom of night, those who were murdered and those who emerged from its inferno. He considered himself and was recognized as their advocate, but not in a vacuum, never in a vacuum. There were two distinct yet interconnected, even symbiotic concepts that defined his philosophy with respect to Holocaust remembrance. On the one hand, He insisted strenuously that the Jewish essence of the Shoah must never be effaced, diluted, or minimized. On the other hand, he was adamant that the lessons to be drawn from the event had to be seen as universal in nature. Not all the survivors of the Shoah were able to transcend all the horrors they had experienced and witnessed. Suffering, he once observed, and I quote, gives man no privileges. It all depends on what he does with it. If he uses his suffering against man, he betrays it. If he uses it to fight evil and humanize destiny, then he elevates it and elevates himself. He described his own reflective existential crossroads in his lecture upon receiving the Nobel Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize. And I quote, "A recollection, the time after the war, the place, Paris. A young man struggles to readjust his life. His mother, his father, his small sister are all gone. He is alone, on the verge of despair, and yet he does not give up. On the contrary, he strives to find a place among the living. He acquires a new language. He makes a few friends who, like himself, believe that the memory of evil will serve as a shield against evil, that the memory of death will serve as a shield against death." End quote. There were so many dimensions to this unique, truly extraordinary individual. Elie Wiesel first came to public prominence at the outset in France, then in the United States, in Israel, and across the globe, as an author whose use of words was invariably elegant, direct, and piercing. The overriding common theme of his more than 60 books of both fiction and nonfiction is survival. Not just the factual circumstance of survival, but its transformative nature and, yes, power. The inmate of a Nazi death camp, the Soviet Jew struggling to retain a national and spiritual identity in the face of political oppression, the open heart surgery patient are all more than literary characters. They are alter egos with whom their author was in perpetual dialogue, and through whom he taught and will continue to teach the reader the essential elements of overcoming whatever is most daunting, most harrowing in one's life. His memoir, Night, brought the horrors of the Holocaust into the consciousness of millions across the globe. His The Jews of Silence became one of the earliest rallying cries on behalf of Soviet Jewry. Equally important was Elie Wiesel, the teacher who made a lasting, often life-changing impact on thousands of students who sat in his classes, first at New York City College, then at Boston University and Eckerd College, and most recently also at Chapman University in California. His lectures at the 92nd Street Y in Manhattan made the mysteries of Hasidism and Jewish biblical thought accessible to 20th and 21st century New Yorkers, Jews and non-Jews alike. He had an encyclopedic knowledge of literature and philosophy, coupled with a seemingly inexhaustible intellectual curiosity. Nietzsche in particular fascinated him. At the same time, he was adamant in excoriating those who sought to exploit or trivialize the Holocaust. Auschwitz, he wrote, signifies not only the failure of 2,000 years of Christian civilization, but also the defeat of the intellect that wants to find a meaning with a capital M in history. What Auschwitz embodied had none. End quote. Much has also been said and written, and much will surely continue to be said and written, about Elie Wiesel, the man of conscience and human rights activist, who urged one US president publicly not to honor the memory of members of Hitler's notorious Waffen-SS, and who implored another to put an end to the crimes against humanity being perpetrated in Bosnia. That place, Elie told President Reagan on April 19, 1985, referring to the Bitburg Military Cemetery in what was then West Germany, is not your place. Your place is with the victims of the SS. And he turned to President Clinton at the opening of the US Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. on April 22, 1993, 2 years before the genocidal massacre at Srebrenica, and said, and again I quote, "And Mr. President, I cannot not tell you something. I have been in the former Yugoslavia last fall. I cannot sleep since for what I have seen. As a Jew, I am saying that we must do something to stop the bloodshed in that country. People fight each other and children die. Why? Something, anything, must be done." But my talk this evening is not meant to be a scholarly assessment of either the life and career or the writing of the Hasidic boy from the Transylvanian town of Siegal, who became a citizen of the world in the truest sense of that term. That will have to wait for another day. Mourning a friend is always deeply personal, and so please bear with me as I grapple, almost a year after Elie's passing, with my memories of a friendship that spanned more than half a century. I remember Elie from the time I was a teenager, when he was a frequent guest in our home. I suppose I understood and related to him differently than most because I first knew him as a not yet 35-year-old friend of my father's who would spend hours with him discussing the politics of the day, in Yiddish, of course. But curiously, their focus was on the present and future rather than the past. Perpetuating memory and defending the dignity of the survivors was a far greater concern of theirs than their own indelible memories and nightmares of the ghettos and camps that separated their life before and after the Shoah. Neither was afraid of what others might think or how others might react. Their words and actions were dictated from deep within themselves. One of my fondest memories of Elie is of him and my father singing Hasidic melodies, nigunim, their voices harmonizing as they took themselves back for a few minutes to the homes and families that had been torn from them. My favorite, perhaps also theirs, Sheibone Beis Hamikdash Bimhera Beyamenu, may the temple be rebuilt quickly in our days. One evening, at the beginning of my senior year of high school, he asked me, as he invariably did, what I was studying and how my classes were going. These were not perfunctory questions. He wanted detailed answers, especially about the books I was reading. I told him that the only class I did not enjoy was an advanced English seminar. I was frustrated by the teacher's approach and his insistence on intellectually pigeonholing the assigned material. Elie was skeptical. He knew I liked, more than liked, literature. Perhaps, he said, I was subconsciously exaggerating. I showed him the most recent written assignment I had received back, annotated with the teacher's comments. Elie read it over and said, "I see what you mean. You won't learn anything that way." He then offered to get together with me once a week to go over the reading with me, as well as my weekly papers. He was living at the Master Hotel on Riverside Drive on 103rd Street, and for the rest of that year, I went there to receive a weekly tutorial. We discussed in depth classical works of literature, and he patiently taught me how one translates thoughts into written sentences that take on a life of their own. Write, here inscribed a photograph of himself to me in French, so that the words become a burning scar. Over the following years, we see each other often, in New York, Israel, and Paris. And first Elie, and then after their marriage, Elie and Marion vacation with our family in San Remo, Italy. In January of 1967, I review Elie's The Jews of Silence in the Johns Hopkins newsletter. And the following month, the New York Times Book Review publishes a letter of mine taking issue with Isaac Bashevis Singer's review of that book. Singer did not endorse Elie's call for, quote, shout and protests on behalf of Soviet Jewry, asking, can the Jews outside actually do anything for the Jews in Russia? Might not such an attempt of worldwide protest do more harm than good? Singer, I wrote in my letter to the editor, fails to do justice to a brilliant author and a magnificent book. Mr. Singer called the book one passionate outcry. I disagree. It is a soft whisper magnified in volume by Elie Wiesel's extraordinary talent. June 6, 1972. Elie calls, his voice trembling with joy. He tells us that he and Marion have a son. 8 days later, my mother carried the child into the Wiesel's living room on Central Park West to receive his name. Shlomo Elisha, son of Eliezer, son of Shlomo. Elisha's birth transforms Elie profoundly, indelibly. For the first time in the more than 10 years that I've known him, he seems genuinely, sorrowfully happy, content. Over the coming years, he is never happier, never more at ease than when he talks about Elisha and, in more recent years, his grandchildren. That same year, when he was appointed Distinguished Professor of Judaic Studies at New York City College, and I was back in New York after graduating from Johns Hopkins, he asked me to be his first teaching assistant. He taught a course on the literature of the Holocaust and a seminar on Hasidic thought. My tasks were to interact with the students on a regular basis, to lecture about Elie's own books, something he would not do, and to grade papers. I vividly remember his attentiveness to his students' questions, regardless of whether they had anything to do with the subject at hand. He would listen patiently, emphasize, give advice. What struck me the most was how accessible he made himself to them. This was especially true for those of his students who were sons or daughters of survivors, and who wanted to speak with him not about their studies, but about themselves, their relationship with their parents, their efforts to understand what their parents had experienced. Elie also imparted wisdom in a way his students would not forget. At the end of the first year we were at City College, he gave the commencement address at graduation. He spoke about the obstacle that Holocaust survivors had to overcome and how they were able to dream once more. What can we learn from their experiences, he asked. First, that it is given to man to build upon ruins, to invent hope when there is none, to call upon love and faith in a world that lacks both. Second, that suffering gives man no privileges. It all depends on what he does with it. If he uses his suffering against man, he betrays it. If he uses it to fight evil and humanize destiny, then he elevates it and elevates himself. And third, that the same applies to culture as such. It all depends what you do with it. Without the moral dimension, culture, too, can lead to inhumanity. September 10th, 1975. I received the devastating news that my father had died suddenly in London. Immediately after my wife, Jeannie, and I told my mother, I called Elie, who rushes over to my parents' apartment. From this moment on, until his death almost 42 years later, Elie remained my strongest link to my father. In his eulogy at my father's funeral, Elie said, quote, I know countless souls sanctified by fire will soon greet you there, and they will embrace you as one of their own and bring you to the heavenly tribunal, and still higher to the celestial throne, and they will say, look, he did not forget us. day in, day out, from morning until late at night, everywhere and under all circumstances, even on Simchas, his spirit glowed in our fire. Few sanctified the Holocaust as he did, few suffered it as he did, few loved its holy martyrs as he did. So they will embrace him with love and gratitude as though he were their defender. And today, a year after his passing, it strikes me, perhaps more than even before, that those words applied also perfectly to Elie himself. By 1978, when President Jimmy Carter appointed him to head the President's Commission on the Holocaust, he was already recognized as the most prominent survivor of the Shoah, whose words had infused the concept of remembrance with contemporary significance and relevance. The general expectation was that the Commission would propose a memorial somewhere in Washington, D.C., along the lines of the Lincoln and Jefferson memorials, somber, dignified, commemorative, and uncontroversial. Elie had other ideas. Under his leadership, the Commission members, my late mother among them, recommended a living educational institution that could fundamentally affect its visitors. The result was the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, whose mission is encapsulated in Elie's now famous phrase, "For the dead and the living, we must bear witness." As I reflect on those early years when the idea of an American remembrance of the Shoah was first beginning to take shape, one particular series of photographs come into focus in my mind. August 1979, the members of President Carter's Commission on the Holocaust are at Auschwitz-Birkenau. 5 survivors of that death camp hold on to one another. Elie in the middle, my mother, Dr. Hadassah Rosensaft, and Zygmunt Strochlitz on either side of him. Chris Lerman and Manne Schwartz beside them. Elie is not there only as chairman of the commission. He is also, perhaps foremost, at the core of a close-knit group of survivors who have been there before and whose memories eclipse the here and now. The knowledge that they understand each other gives them the strength to go on. Soon after becoming chairman of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Council in 1980, he asked me to organize and chair a second-generation advisory committee. He wanted our input, to hear our perspective. He understood early on that it would be the survivors' sons and daughters, and eventually the survivors' grandchildren, to whom the survivors' collective memory had to be transmitted, transferred. This feeling was both intellectual and intuitive on his part. When I speak to others, he said to us at the first International Conference of Children of Holocaust Survivors in May of 1984, "Surely you know that I mean you all the time. You are my audience because it is you who matter. Do you know what we see in you, in all of you? We see in you our heirs, our allies, our younger brothers and sisters. But in a strange way, to all of us, all of you are our children." The remembrance of the Shoah was, of course, central to his being and his writings, but primarily as an influence and inspiration for the betterment of humankind. "I swore," he said in accepting the Nobel Peace Prize, "never to be silent whenever, wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation. We must take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. Sometimes we must interfere. When human lives are endangered, when human dignity is in jeopardy, national borders and sensitivities become irrelevant. Wherever men and women are persecuted because of their race, religion, or political views, that place must, at that moment, become the center of the universe." Addressing a meeting of the United States Holocaust Memorial Council in May of 1980, Elie said, In an age tainted by violence, we must teach this generation and those that follow the origins and consequences of violence. In a society of distrust, skepticism, and moral anguish, we must tell our contemporaries that whatever the answer, it must grow out of human compassion and reflect man's basic quest for justice. The Holocaust was possible because the law was violated by the state itself and its principles distorted by its leaders. From the Holocaust, we have learned that we are responsible for one another. We are responsible for the past and the future as well. The universality of the Jewish tragedy lies in its uniqueness, he declared at the White House in 1981. Only the memory of what was done to the Jewish people and through it to others can save the world from indifference to the ultimate danger that threaten its very existence. And 4 years later, again at the White House, he returned to this theme. I have learned that the Holocaust was a unique and uniquely Jewish event, albeit with universal implications, he said. Not all victims were Jews, but all Jews were victims, end quote. Perhaps one of Elie's most powerful statements on the urgency, the moral imperative of confronting genocide head-on came on July 4th, 2004, when he spoke at the Darfur Emergency Summit, convened in New York City by the American Jewish World Service and the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. As a Jew who does not compare any event to the Holocaust, he said, I feel concerned and challenged by the Sudanese tragedy. We must be involved. How can we reproach the indifference of non-Jews to Jewish suffering if we remain indifferent to another people's plight? Lo ta'amod al dam re'acha is a biblical commandment. Thou shalt not stand idly by the shedding of the blood of thy fellow man. The word is not achicha, thy Jewish brother, but re'acha, thy fellow human being, be he or she Jewish or not. All are entitled to live with dignity and hope. All are entitled to live without fear and pain. Not to insist Sudan's victims today would, for me, be unworthy of what I have learned from my teachers, my ancestors, and my friends, namely that God alone is alone. His creatures must never be. Elie was always, unabashedly, unequivocally Jewish. But in sharp contrast to many of his contemporaries, he neither flaunted his Jewishness nor presumed to impose it on others. Rather, he sought to explain its mysteries and to convey his love of the Jewish religion, of Jewish culture and tradition, of Jewish mysticism and Jewish mysteries. And he did so with deep affection and an equally profound reverence for the subject matter, and perhaps equally important, with respect for his readers and listeners. Most important, his Jewishness was never chauvinistic or exclusionary. To be Jewish, he explained, is to recognize that every person is created in God's image and thus worthy of respect. Being Jewish, to me, is to reject fanaticism everywhere. June 1981. We are in Israel for the World Gathering of Holocaust Survivors. Elie had been asked by the organizers to draft a legacy of the survivors for the occasion. He had written it in both French and Yiddish. In the lobby of the Hilton Hotel in Tel Aviv, Elie called me over, gave me a sheet of paper, and asked, have you seen the English translation of the legacy they prepared? I told him I had not. After I finished reading the text, he tells me that he finds it flat, prosaic. Please write a new translation, he asked me, adding, I trust you. It has always been a tremendous source of pride for me that when the legacy was read in multiple languages during the closing ceremony at the Western Wall in Jerusalem, The English version was my translation of Elie's text, which he had approved. He believed fervently, passionately, that a paramount responsibility inherent in his survival, alongside remembrance, was to speak out forcefully against indifference and against suffering, persecution, or oppression of any kind. His charge to the thousands of survivors and their children assembled in Jerusalem for the 1981 World Gathering reflected the universality of this worldview. In an age tainted by violence, we must teach coming generation of the origins and consequences of violence. In a society of bigotry and indifference, we must tell our contemporaries that whatever the answer, it must grow out of human compassion and reflect man's relentless quest for justice and memory. And we must insist again and again that it is the Jew who carries that message of humankind to mankind. In this regard, his message was consistent over the years. In his Nobel lecture, he spoke about the need to remember not only Jewish suffering, but also, and I quote, that of the Ethiopians, the Cambodians, the boat people, Palestinian, the Mesquite Indian, the Argentinian desaparecidos. The list seems endless. His universal message remained the same whether he was speaking at a human rights conference, at a university, to parliamentarians, or in the shadow of Nazi death camp crematoria. January 1995. Elie is at Auschwitz-Birkenau. His words during the ceremony marking the 50th anniversary of that death camp's liberation are searing. Quote, "In this place of darkness and malediction, we can but stand in awe and remember its stateless, faceless, and nameless victims. Close your eyes and look. Endless nocturnal processions are converging here. And here it is always night. Here heaven and earth are on fire. Close your eyes and listen. Listen to the silent screams of terrified mothers, the prayers of anguished old men and women. Listen to the tears of children, Jewish children, a beautiful little girl among them, with golden hair, whose vulnerable tenderness has never left me. Look and listen as they quietly walk toward dark flames so gigantic that the planet itself seemed in danger." But he makes clear that his main focus is neither retrospective nor introspective. As we reflect upon the past, Elie says in the same 1995 speech at Auschwitz, we must address ourselves to the present and the future. In the name of all that is sacred in memory, let us stop the bloodshed in Bosnia, Rwanda, and Chechnya, the vicious and ruthless terror against Jews in the Holy Land. Let us reject and oppose more effectively religious fanaticism and racial hate. Typically, Elie does not forget his friends, even at Auschwitz, perhaps especially not at Auschwitz. After escaping and being recaptured by the Germans, my father was tortured for months on end in the notorious Block 11 of the main Auschwitz camp, known as the Death Block. Days after Elie's January 1995 speech at Auschwitz, I received a note in the mail from him, sent from Paris. Quote, "In front of Block 11, I thought a lot, profoundly, about your father and about all of you," end quote. January of 2000. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum holds a 3-day conference in Washington, D.C. on Jewish life in the displaced person camps scattered across Germany, Poland, and Italy during the years after the end of World War II. The conference is organized by several members of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Council who were born in these DP camps, together with members of the museum's second generation committee. Elie is the conference's keynote speaker. I introduce him as the one person who has had the greatest impact on the second generation as a whole. His autobiographical Night enabled us to relate to our parents' experiences through the eyes and heart of one who experienced the Holocaust as a teenager. His novels allowed us to identify with fictional characters who asked the very question that were haunting us. And his commitment to human rights, his readiness to apply the lessons of the Holocaust to contemporary issues, while at all times emphasizing its Jewish particularity, have enabled us to synthesize past and present. In his address, Elie urges the survivors in the audience to record their memories, their experiences. Please write, he tells them. This is the last chance. 30 years from now, who will still be here? Then, with every one of us, something of truth with a capital T will die with him or her. That is why some of us are trying to establish a special publishing house, just to publish memoirs, diaries, prayers of survivors. Later that year, with a special grant from Random House, Inc., Elie's publisher, we established the Holocaust Survivors Memoirs Project. Elie asked me to spearhead and oversee this initiative. Over the course of the next 12 years, under the auspices of first the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and then Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, we published 26 survivor memoirs in 20 volumes in English and 4 more in Hebrew. When Elie was born into a family of Vizhnitzer Hasidim in 1928, his birthplace, the Transylvanian town of Siegal in the Carpathian Mountains, was part of Romania. It came under Hungarian rule early in World War II, and today is once more in Romania. The Siegal of his childhood, of his parents and grandparents, remained the anchor of his spiritual identity throughout his life. He saw Judaism, the Jewish people, Hasidism, his own ethical values, and in many ways his experience during the Holocaust and thereafter, through the lens, or perhaps better, through the prism of his memories of Siegal. For he did not want to remember his parents or his sister Zipporah as he last saw them at Auschwitz-Birkenau or at Buchenwald. They were most vivid in his mind's eye as they had lived in Siegal, when they were happy, before the devastation that tore his world apart. I am convinced that it was this Siegal-centric perspective that enabled him to transcend the horrors of the Shoah. He never allowed Auschwitz or Buchenwald to define him. June 2008. We are in Petra, Jordan. Elie and his wife Marion had asked me to organize an international conference of Nobel laureates for the Elie Wiesel Foundation for Humanity. Hunger is one of the themes. Quote, "Those of us who are never hungry will never understand hunger," said Elie. Hunger brings humiliation. The hungry person thinks of bread and nothing else. Hunger fills his or her universe. His prayer, his aspiration, his hope, his ideal are not lofty. They are a piece of bread. To accept another person's hunger is to condone his or her tragic condition of helplessness, despair, and death. The afternoon of the last day of the conference, he and I walked through the ruins of a 2,000-year-old Nabatean temple. "Tu te rends compte? Do you realize," he says to me, "the distance between Auschwitz and Petra?" At the end of that same summer of 2008, I began to teach about World War II war crimes trial at Cornell Law School. Among the readings I assigned to my students are excerpts from Elie's testimony at the 1987 trial of SS Hauptsturmführer, the equivalent rank of captain, Klaus Barbie, who had been the Gestapo chief in the French city of Lyon between 1942 and 1944. Extradited to France from Bolivia in 1983, Barbie was charged with war crimes, including the deportation of Jews to the Nazi death camp. On July 2, 1987, Elie took the stand in Lyon on the 15th day of the Barbie trial. His purpose, to place the proceedings in their historical and above all moral context. I know we must speak, he said. I do not know how. Since this crime is absolute, all language is imperfect, which is why there is such a feeling of powerlessness in the survivor. It was easier for him to imagine himself free in Auschwitz than it would be for a free man to imagine himself a prisoner in Auschwitz. That is the problem. No one who has not experienced the event will ever be able to understand it. And yet, the survivor is conscious of his duty to bear witness. It is for the dead, but also for the survivors, and even more for their children and yours, that this trial is important. It will weigh on the future in the name of justice, in the name of memory. Justice without memory is an incomplete justice, false and unjust. And then, a paragraph spoken by Elie in the Lyon courtroom that explained not only a far too often overlooked rationale for bringing perpetrators of acts of genocide and other crimes against humanity to justice, but why he himself felt compelled to speak, to write, and to teach. Do you seek fire, said a great Hasidic rabbi? Seek it in the ash. This is what you have been doing here since the beginning of this trial. This is what we have attempted to do since the liberation. We have sought in the ash a truth to affirm. Despite everything, man's dignity. It exists only in memory. And finally, always, there was Jerusalem. Elie was an ardent defender of and advocate for the state of Israel, but he loved Jerusalem, both the actual city and the ethereal, incorporeal concept of the place to which Jews yearned to return for almost 2,000 years. The original city on a hill that provided a psychological, spiritual refuge that even the Nazis could not take away from the child he had been in a Birkenau barrack, surrounded by death and desolation. Walking in Jerusalem with Elie was a timeless experience, almost like accompanying him to a place he knew intimately, but that somehow remained out of reach. I see myself back in my town, he wrote in A Beggar in Jerusalem, back in my childhood, Yom Kippur, day of fasting, of atonement. That evening, one cry burst with the same force from every heart, next year in Jerusalem. On my right, among the men draped in their prayer shawl, there was one who did not pray. The next morning, I saw him again at the entrance of the Beit HaMidrash, among the beggars and simple-minded. I offered him some change. He refused. I do not need it, my child, he said. I asked him how he subsisted. On dreams, he answered. For Elie, Auschwitz and Jerusalem, Siegal and Petra, Paris, New York, and Washington were all linked together in a mystical chain that existed beyond reason or explanation. Perhaps my favorite of the many stories I heard him tell is the following Hasidic tale. Somewhere, said Rebbe Nachman of Bratslav, there lived the man who asked the question to which there is no answer. A generation later, in another place, there lived the man who asked another question to which there is no answer either. And he doesn't know, he cannot know, that his question is actually an answer to the first. My visits with Elie in the weeks before he died were deeply personal and emotional. He spoke nostalgically about the vacations he, Marion, and Elisha had spent with our family, how he had been able to relax with us. I miss your father, he said. He wanted to know about our daughter, Jody, and our grandchildren, and whether I was satisfied with my work and career. He reminded me how he had co-officiated Jeannie's and my wedding, how he had eulogized my father at his funeral. He had also been one of the witnesses at Jodi's wedding and had recited a blessing at the joint bris simchat bat ceremony when we welcomed our twin grandchildren into the Jewish community. "I promised your father I would watch over you," he told me several times. But we also spoke about the present, about the depressing state of politics in both the United States and Israel, and about the presidential election campaign then underway. He told me how much he liked and respected Hillary Clinton, reminisced about his private meeting with Barack Obama, and said that while he had met Donald Trump, he was repulsed by his xenophobic rhetoric. Sitting with him, far more frail than I had ever seen him, I realized that he had totally retained his moral and aesthetic compass. Elie could never abide crudeness or boorishness, whether in speech or in behavior. He abhorred bigotry of any kind, against Jews certainly, but with equal fervor if it was directed at any other group. In the past, we had often argued politics, but now he seemed to be giving me one final assessment, a mental guide in case I should ever be uncertain where he stood. A sad reminder that I would soon no longer be able to ask him his opinion directly, but would only be able to imagine what he would say and what he would advise me to do. For more than 5 decades, I could always call or visit him. Raconte was his first word to me in French whenever he saw me or heard my voice. Tell me. He genuinely wanted to know what was happening in the lives of those he cared about, and he knew how to listen. Now I, like so many others, will have to make do with memories and with rereading or rehearing his words. At the end of my favorite of his novels, The Town Beyond the Wall, the protagonist, Michael, is in a prison cell speaking in what appears at first to be a stream of consciousness monologue to another prisoner whose name turned out to be Eliezer. In fact, Michael is bequeathing to Eliezer an intellectual, moral legacy. What I say to you, pass on to you, I learned from a friend, the only one I had. He taught me the art and the necessity of clinging to humanity, never deserting humanity, end quote. And then, after he had said all there was to say, and again I quote, Michael had come to the end of his strength. Before him the night was receding, as on a mountain before dawn. All of Elie's books, all of his lectures, all the conversation any of us had with him constituted his legacy to us and to the world, what he wanted to pass on to us. We wanted his presence in our midst to continue far longer, for him not to stop speaking to us. But Elie, like his fictional Michael, came to the end of his strength, and his night receded. It is now up to us to convey to others into the future all that he taught us, all that we heard and learned from him. Thank you.
We'll take questions. If you have a question, please raise your hands and I'll pass the mic around. I'll ask a question. I'll loosen you up. I need questions from the audience too. Do you have others from your close relationship with Elie Wiesel? You really are, in so many ways, in your work, in your own words, carrying on his legacy. Are there other second generations that had the type of contact that you had with him, sort of a group that you're part of in a, I don't mean in a formal sense, but in an informal sense that you confer with?
The answer is yes and no. No, in the sense of there being a collective. One of the mysteries of Hasidism, one of the mysteries of certain Hasidic masters, is that they had individual direct relationships with their disciples. It was a one-on-one relationship. And Elie had many of those. You will find many people in New York, in Israel, in Boston, in Paris, who will tell you that they enjoyed a very personal, intimate relationship with him, and that his dialogue with them, his conversations with them were unique and special. And when we occasionally compare notes of them, they are different. It wasn't that he was repeating some kind of rote, that he was just, there's this old line, everything that has been said, everything that needs to be said has been said, but not necessarily by everyone. Well, Elie didn't repeat himself in that sense. He didn't have something, so he talked to the person at what was necessary for that moment. So yes, there are quite a few who have who had a close relationship, but I would suggest that each one was different. Each one was unique.
I'll ask also about sort of looking towards the future in terms of transmitting the memory and the legacy. If you could speak a little bit about the challenges that you see facing the next generation and the next generation moving forward.
This is sort of a stealing my own thunder from what I'm supposed to be speaking about tomorrow, so I'll...
Well, you can be vague and have a teaser.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm sort of trying to do. Look, the reality is that the memory we are transmitting is not ours, but it is a memory that we have absorbed and that we are transmitting necessarily with our own perspective. Perhaps the best, and this is not something I'm about to say tomorrow, in the prologue to one of Elie's books, book called The Gates of the Forest, and I'll paraphrase it. One day when a catastrophe was about to befall the Jewish people, the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, went to a particular clearing in a forest, lit a fire, pronounced a prayer, and the catastrophe was averted. A generation later, the Maggid of Mezerich, the Baal Shem Tov's successor, was confronted with a similar catastrophe, and he went into the forest, found the clearing, lit the fire, but said, I no longer remember, I don't know the prayer. A generation later, the next in line didn't remember where the clearing was and then how to run the fire. And finally, it came to the great-grandson of the Baal Shem Tov, who was sitting with his hand in his head and said, I no longer know the clearing, to find the clearing. I don't know how to light the fire. I don't know the prayer. All I know is the story. And that had to be sufficient, and it was. That's sort of where we are, and that's sort of the transmission of memory, and more about that tomorrow. The lady in the back.
Question in the back.
Yes, I just want to make.
Just 1 second.
Let me give you the mic so the audience can hear.
First of all, you are the closest person to Elie, and you were just absolutely marvelous. But I have a very personal thought. Way back, right before I was married to my husband, Elie Wiesel, he comes home one day and says to me, Elie Wiesel was in our office. My husband was a lawyer, and the gentlemen that were his partners were very involved in Israel. And I was very impressed. So that is all I can tell you, that there was a personal relationship between my husband and Mr. Wiesel.
Thank you.
Okay, I knew the audience would open up.
Mr. Wiesel spoke so universally about his experiences and his acceptance of his own experiences. And each generation, that acceptance changes. My father's visions of the past were not mine. They were very different, and yet there was a sense of loss. How did he help his son deal with the past?
The question was how Elie Wiesel helped his son deal with the past. Actually, if you go online, last week, Elisha Wiesel wrote a beautiful piece about his relationship with his father and about a kind of rebellion he had for a while against the overpowering presence of the Holocaust in terms of the relationship. And basically, Elie's way of dealing with it was to not impose anything on his son, not to force him in any way, and to let the relationship develop. And as he said, he wanted his son to be. And whatever else would follow, would follow.
Hi, I wanted to say that I'm a second generation person, and I read Night when I was in my teens, and it told me everything that my own father didn't tell me. And I related to it on that level. It wasn't until I was a grown woman that I went to the Holocaust Museum for the 10th anniversary, and Elie Wiesel was there the last day. And what you said about him is spot on. He was always on message. Not that he said the same thing repeatedly, but it wasn't until then that I realized that his humanity was beyond just Jewish people and Jewish causes and the Holocaust. And it was then that I really learned something from him that I hadn't in all the years preceding. So thank you for being here.
Hi, I just had a question about Elie's use of French. I'm second generation also. My parents were in Paris during the war, so I grew up in a French-speaking home. I know that his original writings were generally in French and then translated, but from what you're saying, it sounds like his conversation, was that the language at their home? Or if you could just clarify a little bit more about, why he decided to write in French and, continue writing in French, and if that was his, the language of their home.
The question was about Elie's use of French and whether that was the language in their home. Elie's original languages were Yiddish and Hebrew. He spoke, understood Hungarian, Romanian, but those were never his languages. But he found himself in 1945, in April 1945, as an orphan, not yet 17 years old, in Buchenwald. His father had died some weeks before the liberation. His mother and sister were killed, murdered in a gas chamber. And at that point, he did not know that his two other sisters were alive. And there was an outfit in France, OSE, an organization for the saving of children, Organisation Secours aux Enfants. And they brought a group of children from Buchenwald, a group of orphans, to France. And so Elie, as he said in his Nobel lecture, or in accepting the Nobel Peace Prize, he literally, in a sense, had to reinvent himself intellectually. And to a large extent, I suspect that had to be done with a break from the past linguistically. And he learned French, which for those who speak French happens to be one of the most beautiful, one of the most lyrical languages. And he related to it. And it was a language in which he could write. Yes, he could write in English. And he did. But it wasn't his creative language. And yes, he could and did write in Yiddish. And that was the language, perhaps, of his greatest outcry. Night was originally written as a memoir in Yiddish, published in Latin America, in Buenos Aires, called And the World Kept Silence. And Night was adapted from that. And the tone of the two is different. One has far more anger. And it's perhaps natural. At home, well, he and Marion spoke French. She translated many of his books. And it was their common intellectual language. He and Elisha spoke English. With his grandchildren, he spoke English. And when he studied Talmud, it was in Hebrew. So that, language in a sense has each language has its own musical meter, its own rhythm. And it was no different for Elie.
I just want to ask one more question about the lessons of the Holocaust being both lessons for the Jewish people, memory for the Jewish people, but also universal lessons, which you touched on. And I'm asking, as the mom of 3 young children who learn about the Holocaust in school today, and I feel like there's a move in the Jewish community to emphasize more of the universal lessons. And I guess I'm just wondering about when you're a survivor, the children of survivors, or you can, sort of in your historical memory, you can hold on to the Holocaust. It's one thing to say we have to remember the particular and also the universal. I wonder what your take is, just sort of from what you see around, if there is at some point a danger in too much universalizing the message of the Holocaust.
The question is whether there's a danger of universalizing the Holocaust. Again, probably not the satisfactory answer. It's yes and no. Yes, the Holocaust should not be universalized. It was a Jewish tragedy. It was a Jewish catastrophe. The final solution was aimed at Jews. And yes, there were others who perished in the same flames for much the same reason. The Roma and Sinti, for one. There were Poles who were murdered because they were Polish intellectuals and like, but no one would have created the gas chambers and crematoria of Birkenau for anybody else. That was created for the implementation of the final solution of the Jewish question, period, paragraph. That's the starting point. So when we talk about the Holocaust, that is a uniquely Jewish experience. That does not mean, however, and now I am moving from talking about Elie to going into much more personal. That does not mean that someone else's tragedy, someone else's genocide, whether it's Armenian, whether it's the Yazidis in today's Iraq, whether it's the Tutsis in Rwanda, whether it's Bosnian Muslims in Srebrenica, that any of their tragedies is any less than ours or of any lesser significance than ours. And we lose our humanity if we ever start thinking in terms of it's only our pain that counts. And so the balancing act here, look, I firmly believe that in the aftermath of the Holocaust, in 1946, 45, 46, 47, 48, during the years when the Genocide Convention was drafted and adopted, there probably was a belief, even a certainty, that nothing like the Holocaust would ever happen again. And you know what? For quite a while, that was the case. I mean, for quite a while, things were, yes, there were tragedies, yes, there were mass killings, but, it was kept into some kind of norms. And then all of a sudden, we end up with Cambodia, and with Darfur, and with Bosnia, and with Rwanda, and with the Yazidis, and. And all of a sudden, we realize that, yes, the Holocaust was on a greater scope. It was far more international in scope. It was aimed at getting, Eichmann was a much more methodical engineer of death in transporting people from one place to the other. But believe me, from the perspective of the individuals receiving the unwanted attention, no one is going to say, oh, I'm not being taken to a gas chamber, I'm only being killed by a machete, I feel so much better. So, I don't mean to make light of it, but that's sort of the reality. And if we don't understand and are not sympathetic and empathetic to the pain of others, then learning about the Holocaust becomes an exercise in archaeology. And it shouldn't, certainly not now, one generation after, when those of us here who I would suggest that every single person in this room who is not a survivor has known and listened to survivors, either as parents or as friends or as neighbors or as fellow congregants. And certainly in our stage of this particular drama, we have to make sure that it becomes relevant so that when your children learn about the Holocaust, they also understand intuitively that when it's happening to someone else, they need to, at the very least, be sensitive to it. And if they can, which most people are not in a position to, do something about it. But at least understand that it's something happening that should not be happening.
Thank you. Thank you very much.